here to talk about mind control. A couple of things up front, though, as Norman's mentioned, I think a couple other people have mentioned. I'm not really here to bash. Another thing I'm not here to do is allege any kind of conspiracy. I don't think they're that smart. I was an elder for 10 years, and I can state categorically that at no time during that 10 years did we sit in the library in the Kingdom Hall and think, what can we do to mentally manipulate and control the minds of our congregation? But what I think, and I'll offer strictly an opinion here, is that the elements of mind control that we're going to talk about here are systemic within the Watchtower organization. And really, they're part of the culture. And one of the things, probably the most successful type of mind control there is when you teach someone to control their own mind the way you want them to control it. It saves you a lot of work. Before we talk about what mind control is, we'll talk about what it isn't. There's a difference between mind control and brainwashing. A lot of people say, oh, Jehovah's Witnesses, they're brainwashed. I would disagree with that. Brainwashing was first, the term was coined in 1951 by a journalist named Edward Hunter, and he was writing about returning or present American POWs from the Korean conflict that had been captured by the North Koreans, subsequently taken by the Chinese, and they were re-educated. What they actually got these guys to do was to sign confessions confessing to war crimes that these guys knew that they had committed. But brainwashing is typically coercive. Mind control is subversive. Brainwashing is very direct. They haul you off somewhere, throw you in a room. They may apply physical force, and there's certainly mental force involved there. Whereas mind control is much more subversive, much more gentle. Brainwashing usually involves an adversarial relationship. It's you and them, and they're trying to get you to do something you really don't want to do. Mind control is usually between people who would otherwise be considered as friends or peers. Mind control is everywhere. Turn on your TV, you get about 5 minutes of TV program, and then you get about 5 minutes of mind control. They call it advertisements. The question is not whether or not mind control is there. The question is who is using it and for what purpose. Robert J. Lifton wrote a work back in the 60s called Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism. It's a tough read. The 8 criteria of mind control that I'm going to mention here came from that book. It's chapter 22 if you want to get into it. But as we look at these, think about your experience with the Watchtower and whether or not you have ever noticed any of these elements of mind control. The first one is called milieu control. Milieu is a French word that means basically your environment or your surroundings. And if you can control somebody's environment or their surroundings, you control their communication. You control their input, their output, and ultimately, you control their communication even with themselves, their very thoughts. There are many ways of achieving that. One that many of the communal cults use is communes, physical isolation. They physically withdraw from the outside world, and that and the rest of these techniques are elements of mind control that are applied. There's other ways too, one of which is even if you don't do the physical isolation, there's mental isolation there. You can flood a person with so much information that they have trouble processing what you're giving them, much less anything that comes from outside. You can also keep them so busy that they don't have time to investigate the information that you're giving them. Lifton wrote in his book, he says, through this milieu control, the totalist environment seeks to establish domain not only over the individual's communication with the outside. All that he sees and hears and reads and writes, his experiences and his expressions, but also in its penetration in his inner life, over what we may speak of as his communication with himself. And he says it creates an atmosphere uncomfortably reminiscent of George Orwell's 1984. If you haven't read 1984, you really need to. I had not read it since long before I became one of Jehovah's Witnesses. I read it after I got out and was just amazed at the similarities there. Animal Farm's another good one. It's a shorter read, but you'll see a lot of the same similarities there. Among Jehovah's Witnesses, we see the constant phrase, keep separate from the world. Well, it's a scriptural admonition. The question is just how far do you carry it? We also see in an effort to control the input of information to its followers, we see the demonizing of people like us that are here tonight. They're scared to death of what we have to say. They're scared to death of us expressing ourselves and telling what we've dealt with. The good news is that milieu control never succeeds totally. You cannot totally isolate someone. The best that those who seek to control others can do is to limit the influence that the outside has on the people that they're trying to control. The second one of my favorites, as I was doing this, there were a couple of favorites. Mystical manipulation is one of my favorites. This is basically where the controller seeks to invest himself with a mystical or a supernatural aura, thereby making himself a whole lot more than he really is and exercising that much control over others. I'll give you some examples. Norman loves his Revelation book, so do I. We're going to spend a little time in that. I didn't bring the book with me. I just copied and pasted from the CD-ROM. It's one of the best tools there is. It's the Watchtower CD-ROM because you can find anything you need pretty quickly. Here's what they write. This is on pages 11 and 12. In the Bible, anointed Christians are called Jesus' brothers, and as his brothers, they share the same Father and the same mother. Their father is Jehovah God, hence their mother must be the woman, God's lifelike celestial organization. They become a secondary part of the seed, Christ Jesus being the primary part. The congregation of these Spirit-begotten Christians on earth make up God's visible organization that serves under his woman-like organization in the heavens, where they will be united with Christ Jesus at their resurrection. So first of all, this anointed, or the 144,000, are cast as Christ's brothers, secondary part of the seed. It's pretty important. Continuing on page 16, under the subheading Channel of Communication. Thus John received the inspired record through an angelic messenger. He wrote it in a scroll, transmitting it to the congregations of his time. Happily for us, God has preserved it for the encouragement of the more than 50,000 congregations of his united servants on earth today. God had a channel for communicating revelation in John's day, and John was the earthly part of that channel. Likewise, God has a channel for giving spiritual nourishment to his slaves today. In his great prophecy concerning the conclusion of the system of things, Jesus identified the earthly part of this channel as the faithful and discreet slave whom his master appointed over his domestics to give them their food at the proper time. He uses this John class in unlocking the meaning of prophecy. So here they've identified themselves as the faithful and discreet slave, as the John class, people in the same class as John that God used to communicate revelation. This John class always cracked me up. I have to say it. John class sounds like potty training to me, but anyway. It's interesting too that this term only appears 123 times in Watchtower literature. It appears 119 times just in the Revelation book. They only used it 4 times elsewhere, so Somebody must have told them the joke, too. Anyway, what they've done here is they've really invested themselves with this mystical aura. Here they are, the faithful and discreet slave class, the John class. But who wrote this? The faithful and discreet slave. So you end up with this circular question. Who are you? Oh, we're the faithful and discreet slave. Well, how do we know that? Well, because we told you. Well, why should we believe you? Because we're the faithful and discreet slave. And you start all over again. Well, continuing on in this Revelation book, and I'll tell you, in 1995, when I stepped down from being an elder, one of the things that just drove me out was that we were about to go through this book the third time in book study, and I couldn't do it. By then, I really knew that it wasn't right. But for the remainder of the book, this faithful and discreet slave class cast themselves in all kinds of interesting roles that really falsely increases their importance, not only their importance, but the importance of their pronouncements. They cast themselves, first of all, as the 24 elders around the throne of God. 144,000, of course, in Revelation 7:9. On page 79 of the Revelation book, it talks about the 7 lampstands around the throne. It says John himself tells us the significance of the 7 lamps. These mean the 7 spirits of God. The number 7 symbolizes divine completeness, so the 7 lamps must represent the fullness of the enlightening force of the Holy Spirit. How grateful the John class today is that it has been entrusted with this enlightenment. Later on in Revelation, the 7 trumpets in Revelation 8:6 are likened to the 7 pronouncements or proclamations that were made at Watchtower conventions from 1922 to 1928. The locusts, Revelation 9:7 through 9, are pictured as this 144,000. Their sting were the warnings contained in the literature prepared by the John class. The cavalry, later on in Revelation chapter 9, it says that they killed the 1/3 of mankind. This was likened in the Revelation book to their making known that Christendom and its clergy are completely dead spiritually, cast off by Jehovah, and ready for the fiery furnace of everlasting destruction. The 2 witnesses, Revelation 11, guess who they are? The faithful and discreet slave. Their death pictured the imprisonment of the board of directors during World War I, and they're raising up. The 2 witnesses were raised up. Their raising up pictured their renewed activity in 1919. Because the other side of this is the casting of the enemies or the opponents of the 144,000 in less pleasant roles, might we say. Those of Babylon the great harlot, the false religion, and also the various beasts, including the one that they cast us to the United Nations, which Jerry covered nicely. All of this really has the effect of building up a polarity of trust and mistrust. We can trust what comes from the faithful slave. We can't trust anything that comes from anybody else. This is from the February 15, 1981 Watchtower. It talks about our view of the slave. We can benefit from this consideration if we have once established what If we have once established what instrument God is using as his slave to dispense spiritual food to his people, surely Jehovah is not pleased if we receive that food as though it might contain something harmful. We should have confidence in the channel that God is using. At the beginning of our involvement as witnesses, we were encouraged to examine our beliefs. I think Dick has the Truth That Leads to Eternal Life. Page 13 of that book, and that was the first book that I studied when I became one of Jehovah's Witnesses. Page 13 on that book says, we need to examine not only what we personally believe, but also what is taught by any religious organization with which we may be associated. The implication, of course, there is that we examine them critically, we question them. Because we went door to door, we encouraged other people to do that with our religions. I mean, with their religions, not ours. But once we were fully indoctrinated, we weren't to question anymore. I had 2 circuit overseers in a row tell me, I talked about the Bereans, that were commended for searching the scriptures daily and improving these things. And 2 circuit overseers in a row tell me that whole illustration only applied before you were baptized. You get all the questions out before you were baptized. After you were baptized, no more. Good, we got them in order. The next element of mind control is the demand for purity. I like to talk about this as being digital thinking. I'm a computer geek, and digital versus analog. Digital is either on or off. There's no in between. It's black and white. Everything, and generally mind control organizations, everything inside is good, everything outside is bad. And I haven't thought of this in years, but I remember many years ago, my wife and I went to Florida to visit some friends of ours. And we went to Busch Gardens, went to Disney World. This was long enough ago that it was before they built Epcot at Disney. So it was a while ago. But we took this sister from our congregation and her young son with us. And here we are at Disney World. We camped out at Disney World, having a nice time. And this woman normally was a pioneer. We were sitting there one day and she kind of sighed. She says, I feel like I'm being dragged right back into the world. I'm thinking to myself, good grief, we're at Disney World. Dragged back into Disney World. That's what she meant. Anyway. An example of this polarity, the January 15th, 2001 Watchtower. Under the subject, Keep in Step with Jehovah's Organization, it says, it was also discerned in the 1920s that there are 2 opposing organizations, Jehovah's and Satan's. The fight is on between them, and we will be on the winning side only if we keep in step with Jehovah's organization. At this point, there's some fear that sets in here. I don't want to be on the losing side of that battle. So, obviously, the implication there is to stick close to the organization. A couple other things. I think whoever's coming next, I think, is going to talk about a little guilt and fear. But one of the things that I heard years ago that really caught me was the difference between guilt and shame. Guilt says I did a bad thing. Shame says I'm a bad person. And so much of these mind control techniques really work on people's natural feelings of guilt and shame if they don't measure up to what's expected of them. And once we're taught to apply this polarity to things outside, we learn pretty quickly to do it inside. So not only are we judging things in an absolute black and white, on and off, good and bad mode as we view things outside, then it starts to work on our inside. And that's when, basically, like a wind-up machine, those who have sought to control us don't even have to work anymore. Their work's done, now we're going to do it for them. Lifton writes in his book, he says, therefore, one of the best ways to relieve himself of some of this burden of guilt is to denounce continuously and hostilely those same outside influences. The more guilty he feels, the greater his hatred, the more threatening they seem. In this manner, the universal psychological tendency toward projection is nourished and institutionalized, leading to mass hatreds, purges of heretics, and to political and religious holy wars. And basically what it's saying there is once that guilt works on you, you feel guilty for perhaps doubting the organization, and you're going to denounce people who doubt the organization. And we see this in people denouncing apostates and Christendom and her clergy. Another way of ridding ourselves of guilt is confession. The next point that we have here is the cult of confession. There's an old saying that confession is good for the soul. It's a good way to rid ourselves of guilt and shame. And in the Catholic Church, at least until recently, one's very salvation was tied to their confessing of their sins and gaining absolution from a priest. It's not quite that overt with Jehovah's Witnesses, but if you think back, could you have committed a sin, just gone to Jehovah, confessed it, and that was the end of it, if it was something serious? They mentioned that very, very well in his testimony here. Confession to Jehovah wasn't enough. Serious things had to be handled by the elders in the judicial system. Now, Dick was stealing all my material earlier here. He talked about the Achan syndrome, and this is a lot more common, I think, than a lot of people might know. It's not uncommon in a congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses when things aren't going well for the elders to discuss among themselves, do we have an Achan among us? You know, is there somebody that might be doing something that's unconfessed that's hindering the flow of Jehovah's Spirit? Then again, guilt, shame take over, and then individuals start thinking, oh, I wonder if I'm the one. Looking back, did I do something? Did I say something to somebody or something like that? I'm the Achan. So again, guilt and shame are great tools there. Sacred science is our next one. You know, we talked under mystical manipulation about the controllers investing themselves with this mystical or supernatural aura. Well, the scientific side of that is that they invest themselves with a scientific aura. Lifton writes regarding that, he says, transcending ordinary concerns of logic, however, the milieu at the same time makes exaggerated claim of airtight logic, of absolute scientific precision. I have to this day in my records a letter that I wrote to the Watchtower Society that I thought better of it and never sent it, but criticizing some of their pseudo-science. And we look at books like the creation book, and while I don't disagree with the fact that God created the universe, some of the proofs that they offer there are horrible scientifically. And of course, the bad side of that too is that in many cases, people who don't know any better will take those proofs to the door and regurgitate them on command as though they were absolutely true. The appeal of this is that we've now kind of coupled this mystical aura with this scientific aura, and even though most of us here never claimed to be the 144,000, we kind of got that by extension, and it made us feel like we had a certain amount of power there. Loading the language, this was my other favorite. The Watchtower are absolute experts at wordsmithing. When you think of some of the words that they used to use that they don't use anymore, somebody earlier mentioned colporteur. This is what pioneers were called before they were pioneers. The word literally means a hawker, someone who goes door to door selling books. It's not a very flattering picture, but pioneer, what a great word. I'm a pioneer. I'm blazing trails. I'm boldly going where no man's gone before. All of that sort of thing. They're really good at language. Another one, back call. Has such a cold sound to it. But now they're return visits. We're going to visit someone. It's going to be all nice. Everyone's going to be happy. Another thing of loading the language is what are called stop-think phrases. Things that when somebody says something that doesn't fit in with the group's norms, you spurt this out and it effectively ceases the conversation. One of the ones I love that the Watchtower uses from time to time in articles, and I've heard it in more talks than articles, they'll start to make a point by saying, thinking people agree, The implication is if you disagree, you're not thinking. Many times when witnesses will raise doubts about various things, there's one of two phrases. You're not doubting this is the truth, are you? That is so elegant. It's so elegantly evil, but it's so elegant. This whole using the term the truth. You know, I love to watch people that haven't been on the Watchtower very long try to correct themselves real quickly when they say, oh, I was in the truth. Even though we know it's not anymore. Who's going to argue against the truth? It is, after all, the truth. Who's going to argue with it? The other one, too, is you're not doubting the faithful and discreet slave, are you? Now, here's this group that's been invested with this mystical, supernatural aura that John classed 144,000. Faithful and discreet slave, Ezekiel class. They got more names for that class than anyone can remember in one class. The other part of this is, reducing everything to easily remembered, easily regurgitated phrases. And I've heard the phrase used here a couple times tonight. Where else are we to go? I have a ball on AOL correcting witnesses because they go, oh, where else are we to go? It's a bad paraphrase of John 6:68. Peter didn't ask, where are we to go? He goes, Lord, to whom shall we go away to? So he wasn't talking about a where, he was talking about a who. But that beside the point, that effectively ceases the conversation at that point. You say, well, there's problems with the organization that you and you can bring up anything, they go, well, where else are we going to go? The implication being there is just absolutely nothing for us outside. Witnesses use language so effectively that a witness that's been in for a while can gauge another witness's time that they've been in the truth or their spiritual maturity by how well they use the jargon. When I go in chat rooms online, if I don't remember that jargon and use it, they'll catch me right off and know that I'm not a witness. A friend of mine I met several years ago, he was doing his doctoral thesis on Jehovah's Witnesses, and he did a research paper called Language and Identity at the Kingdom Hall, Discursive Strategies of the Watchtower Society. If you want, I can give you his website afterward. His name is Joel Elliott. If you look up Joel Elliott and the word Jehovah, you can find. He's got several really good scholarly papers on various facets of the Watchtower Society. They're not bashing, they're just good studies on various subjects. Also involved in this whole thing of loading the language is an underlying assumption that language, unlike any other human product, can be owned by a particular group. And the Watchtower really does that. One of the other things that they do is to give specific meanings to generic words. The word apostate is a prime example. I use this all the time online. The word apostate means somebody who left one religion to go to another one. Well, that being the case, many of Jehovah's Witnesses are apostates. But they subtly redefined the term, so now it means somebody who used to be one of Jehovah's Witnesses but left and didn't keep his mouth shut. Doctrine over... The screens are falling quickly. Doctrine over person. Doctrine over person really involves subordinating your own observations and experiences to the teaching of the group. This causes a problem when you notice something or you experience something that goes against what the group teaches. At that point, you either have to totally ignore it or you have to reinterpret it in the light of what the group teaches. This kicks in a lot when individuals start to look outside the group. They're obviously going to see things that don't fit in with the group's teachings, and then they have to go through this reinterpretation. Cognitive dissonance comes in here. I was going to save this till the end, but we'll deal with it now because we don't have too much time before the end. Cognitive dissonance is basically when you have two conflicting pieces of of information. And how you deal with that dissonance or that difference between them can depend on a lot of things. With witnesses, most witnesses had gone through a lot to become witnesses. I know when I became a witness, I gave up a lot of things. Gave up a lot of friends I had. Because when I left behind even more, but that's another story. One of the great illustrations of cognitive dissonance is Aesop's fable of the fox and the grapes. The fox goes out there, there's grapes up on the grapevine, and he's jumping, he's trying to get at them, and he can't do it. He finally says, it'll probably sour anyway, I wouldn't like it. And it's easy to do if he hadn't invested all afternoon jumping for these grapes. And the same thing happens with people in any high control group. If they don't have a lot invested in it, it's easy to leave it behind and reevaluate its importance. But when you've been in for 20 years and you've invested a lot and you've perhaps lost a lot, it's that much harder. So at that point, when conflicting information comes in, you're going to process it differently than you would have 20 years earlier. So there's basically a few ways to deal with dissonance. You can select what it is that you choose to look at. We've talked about the internet here tonight. A lot of witnesses will not look at the internet, not only because they've been told they shouldn't, but also they know there's information out there that is going to cause them some cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is basically an uncomfortable feeling, and nobody likes to be uncomfortable. Another way they can deal with this dissonance is to completely ignore the conflicting information. Just write it out and say, oh, it's wrong. I'm not even going to pay attention to it. Another way is to rationalize it away. When I was leaving the organization, I was amazed at how much rationalization I've done for the past 22 years. We can come up with all kinds of reasons why what somebody says is obviously true isn't. We can reduce its value. We can say, well, it's not that important anyway. We heard this a lot with 1975. Well, it wasn't that big a deal. Yeah, it was at the time. But later on, looking back, people, it's not that big a deal. And finally, they can shoot the messenger. Say, oh, he's an apostate. Nothing he ever says is true anyway. The final element of mind control is the dispensing of existence. And this is where the group has the prerogative to decide who exists and who doesn't. But not literally. They don't kill people. But disfellowshipping is like death. You are as good as dead to all of your former friends. A couple of things about disfellowshipping that I find really interesting. The guy that studied with my wife and I when we came in was disfellowshipped a couple of times. He witnessed to more people when he was disfellowshipped than he did when he wasn't. We kind of get back to that whole guilt thing. He's disfellowshipped, guilty. The more witnessing work I do, the better I'm going to feel. And then finally, annihilation. Jehovah's Witnesses are annihilationists. If you don't make it through again, you cease to exist forever. You just poof, you are gone. That's not a good thing. And when you're disfellowshipped, it's kind of like being annihilated. And finally, on this dispensing of existence, who gets to exist and who doesn't, again, we go back to the old phrase, where else are we to go? We were taught time and again as Jehovah's Witnesses that there is nowhere else for us to go. So thus, if you go somewhere else, you now cease to exist. So as you look at these, two books that, if you're interested in this subject, that you want to look at, The Subtle Power of Spiritual Abuse, very good. And then Steve Hassan's book, Combating the Cult of Mind Control, awesome book. He gets into the 8 criteria of mind control. As you think of these, think about where you've seen them, and as they say, forewarned is forearmed.